Welcome to Untamed Blossoms, the podcast where we celebrate the wild and beautiful journey of womanhood. We're here to create a space where women can connect, inspire, and uplift each other. Untamed Blossoms is more than just a podcast. It's a movement. It's a gathering of strong, fierce women who are breaking free from society's expectations.
Our mission is to deep dive into the stories of incredible women who have embraced their authenticity, even in the face of adversity. We believe by sharing these stories, we can inspire others to do the same. Join us as we sit down with women from all walks of life who have faced their own struggles and emerged as the most authentic versions of themselves. From entrepreneurs to artists, activists to adventurers, we'll explore their triumphs and tribulations. Together, we'll navigate the challenges of self-discovery, self-acceptance, and self-love.
But Untamed Blossoms is more than just conversations. We're a community that gathers for events, immerses ourselves in the beauty of nature, and supports one another in our personal and professional growth. So whether you're seeking inspiration, looking for a supportive sisterhood, or simply want to hear incredible stories of women blazing their own trails, Untamed Blossoms is here for you. Together, let's embrace our wildness, bloom unapologetically, and rewrite the rules. Welcome to Untamed Blossoms.
Welcome to Untamed Blossoms. We're grateful you're here. I'm your host, Amanda Riley.
And I'm Kryssie Riley. Welcome to the pod.
Happy full moon.
Happy full moon.
What a time. In Mercury retrograde. It's also a super moon and a blue moon.
Feeling all the feels. You know, we're Monday. It's a Monday, but yeah, I've been feeling it since the 8th.
Now,
the landscape portal.
I want you to differentiate from your normal feeling the feels of crying.
Oh yeah, no.
Because I do love that.
Yeah.
To
Kryssie
what
cries.
Kryssie cries, our soon to be second podcast. Kryssie cries. What difference have you felt recently that are maybe outside of the normal for you?
It's very heavy.
Okay.
Very heavy energy. I feel just really, really heavy. Like my feet and my emotions are in quicksand. And at first I thought it was because we're buying this house and we're in limbo. We don't get the house. We closed a week ago on everything. And I thought we were going to be, but I knew this 2 weeks was coming. And so just waiting for that to get there and, wanting it to go faster. So I thought maybe that's why I feel heavy and mucky. No, I'm feeling all the muck in every way.
Yeah.
Every way. So I've been, super happy. I feel manicky, like I'm all over the place.
Okay.
I feel really happy, and then I'm real upset. And then I'm in the middle of the road. And the one day, literally, I could not get my eyes open.
Yeah.
Like they felt burny and heavy. Like I could not get and I just laid around pretty much all day.
Yeah.
I just couldn't fathom any energy for anything. It was just, and that's not me.
Totally.
Constantly moving, doing things all the time. So whatever this energy is not normal and
not cool.
Whew, it is.
Yeah.
It's been a good teacher. I definitely have gotten, my husband probably is not loving it, but, we've had a lot of spirited discussion, a lot of emotion that he's having to handle.
Yeah.
Hold space for, which is hard. It's hard when somebody's kind of going through all of that and you're not experiencing the same thing, and let them have that space. And it's been real intense. Real intense. But we're excited about the house, and even today there was more miscommunication, which is real popular in Mercury retrograde. So we thought we're getting it on Monday. We're not getting it until Tuesday evening. So I've had to shift my contractors over to 2 full days. So it's already starting. Yeah. It's already there. But I'm trying really hard not to focus on any of that and just focus on being positive about it. And I got past all of the really heavy emotion, and it was good. It was good for my husband and I's relationship. I felt like we had a lot of really in-depth conversation that came out of it, and it was really good. Yeah. But it wasn't fun at the time.
Totally.
Yeah, it was awful. But that's where I'm at. What about you? Are you feeling this energy?
No, it's weird because I normally do feel it pretty heavy.
Being tired. You've been complaining about being
tired. Very tired.
Yeah.
But other than that, what I will say is I'm feeling very self-centered isn't the right. That's not what it is, but I'm feeling very inward. Like I'm feeling very much like I have a mission. I want to do some things. I'm feeling very motivated to tackle those things and very unmotivated to worry about anyone else's anything at the moment. And I also think that like I'm just I think at my final stage of shedding some old things that I've been holding on to, like identity wise lately. And that's felt really good, but also a little scary because I'm like, who knows what I'll do? Who knows? Because I just don't feel beholden to anything right now. And I'm just like feeling almost like this is the start of everything for me.
Yeah.
And that's like a crazy, weird feeling. I know I told you this earlier, but like literally I was in bed last night, pretending I was like doing like interviews for
Look out, Oprah Winfrey. We're coming. Show.
Like I just like I laid in bed and just felt like if I was being interviewed about our business, about the podcast, about Untamed Blossoms, like what would I say? Like how would I show up in this space? And I've been really thinking a lot about how I communicate and like my purpose and what I want to do. And normally I'm really much more focused, which is very topical for our conversation and our guests today, but I'm normally more focused on how do I make money? How do I ensure I'm financially okay? Like, what do I do? And now like, I'm thinking way less of that and more of like, oh, I know I need to do financially for me right now. I'm just gonna keep doing that. That's done, whatever. And now it's like, what is possible?
The world's opened up to you.
The world is so open. I'm feeling very inspired and encouraged by that. And I'm just surrounding myself by people that make me feel like excited. Like I want to spend time with people who are like encouraging and motivating and telling me like, yeah, you're on the right path. And if anyone, unfortunately for anybody, if anyone is trying to tell me, oh, like, are you nervous about this? Or you should go back here, or you should go back to this comfort, job or whatever. I just like have zero tolerance for it right now. So it's kind of where I am.
You're on the right path.
I think so.
I believe so. I know so.
It's my year of abundance. I'm 38.
I love it.
So cool.
This is an abundant year anyway. It's the 8th year.
It is. Yeah. Totally.
Yeah.
And I just think right now we're experiencing a lot of shedding in a lot of different places as a human species. And I think there's a lot of energy building up right now in general. And I think it's a really great time to reassess where you are and your character that you play. And we talked about human design. We'll be talking about it again today. Surprise, surprise. I think the more people decide to show up authentically themselves and show up to play the part that they were meant to play, not the part that they think they should play, it's going to be interesting.
Well, if you and I's lives are any indication as to how everyone is changing currently, wow, because just the amount of change that you and I have seen in our lives this year is staggering.
Totally.
So,
yeah. Today's guest, one of my dear friends, we've been friends for a long time. Her name's Kryssie. She has been a teacher here in Columbus, Ohio, and we actually met in college. And I was a communication major, just yucking it up, watching films. She was out here doing some really hard work. And I just thought, wow, that's crazy. And then she's continued to inspire me with her just desire to help people do better and be better. And, teaching is such a hard space to be in. And she's taught me a lot about what it means to be a teacher inside and outside of the classroom. And she recently has left the classroom starting this year, still in the education field, but there's a lot of great things that she's been able to take from her past and say, this won't be my future. And she has helped kids also see that and understand that and been a safe space for those kids. So I'm excited to have her on the pod today and talk a little bit about how she took where she came from and used that to project herself in a way to break some generational traumas. So without further ado, Kryssie. Welcome to the pod.
Hello.
Hello, welcome.
I'm so happy to be here. I never thought I'd actually say that on a podcast. I listen to a lot of podcasts, and if I said I never practiced that before, I would be lying. So I'm really excited to be here, and I have loved everyone's story so far. So if you have not listened to all the other episodes, you might want to go back and listen because I do reference a few of them. So, just be ready for that.
No, but some interesting things we're going to talk about today, especially something we haven't really touched on before, is poverty and things people have to do to overcome choices that have been made for them well before they were on this earth. So we would love to start off today with you giving us a little bit of background about where you grew up, how you grew up, anything else you would like to share with us around your origin story, if you will.
Yeah. And you said it perfectly, choices that were made for them long before they joined this earth. And so I'm starting with a little bit of a history lesson for your listeners. If you are not familiar with the Columbus area, this is referring to Columbus, Ohio, where I grew up. And I grew up in the very first neighborhood where anyone settled in Columbus. And surprisingly, I didn't learn that until I was preparing to come on this podcast. So I actually learned a lot of things in preparing for this that made this story come alive even more for me, which has been really interesting as I'm preparing to tell my story, continuing to learn more about my story and just realizing how many stories I have and how many stories everyone has. And so what I really hope people take away is just that context in which we live. And when we see people, they're so much more than the person we see. I mean, they are generations of people that we don't see. And so, I grew up in this area of Columbus, was the first area where anyone ever settled. You might be familiar with the word Sullivant in Columbus. There was actually a land surveyor named Lucas Sullivant in 1797 decided to settle on the west bank of the Scioto River. And this was the first European American settlement in Columbus. And now Sullivan Avenue still runs through the west side of Columbus for about 8 miles. So he settled, they start to develop this area, and it becomes known as Franklinton. And so if you're familiar with this area, you might call it the Bottoms. That's what I call it. And I grew up there. And so it's this low-lying area on the river. And so people started calling it the Bottoms. So I will probably refer to it as both today, the Bottoms or Franklinton. Today, it's more widely known as Franklinton because the area is dealing with some rebuilding, gentrification. Yes. And so this became the initial hub of Columbus. And so, later, Columbus wasn't even the capital yet. People start to settle in, they're working class, they're working in factories and mills. And there were a mix of homes, businesses, commercial areas, and there were some apartments, but a lot of like Queen Anne Victorian homes that you would see in the 1800s. And in the early 1900s, it was a really bustling commercial district. So there were like lots of shops and markets and family-owned businesses and a really tight sense of community. And being close to the river made it a great location because of industry. So they relied on water transportation. And so he really found this piece of land that was very promising for their community. And so it sounds great. And even though Ohio was in the north, there was still racial segregation, and even in schools, and especially with regard to like higher education and things like that. So he settled there, but there was still racial segregation happening. There was redlining, which is where, you probably hear about that a lot today, where literally a map was taken out and they would circle areas in red and say, either these are undesired areas and we're going to force Black and brown people, as well as immigrants, to settle in these areas because they're undesirable, or Black and brown people, as well as immigrants, were already settled there. Mm. And so they deemed those undesirable because of the people who were already living there. And so naturally, it was difficult to obtain property. People were not investing in the area, they weren't developing there. And if you were a Black American, you were still facing the threat of being lynched because that was still legal here in Ohio. So it was really life or death for Black people every day in Ohio, even though slavery was not around at this time in Ohio. And so, um, you know, what's really interesting is that you can see in these early times, and this was like early 1800s, Black women started to create these mutual aid societies to help one another when society wasn't helping them. And I just found that interesting because I try to think a lot like, how can I impact the community and what can I do? And I just find it so interesting that, even back at this time when society was basically writing people off, these Black women came together and were like, no, not us. Like, how can we help our community? Mm-hmm. And they just poured into each other. And I just think, wow, if we could all just do that today, like, what if we all just rallied around each other and we're like, let's give to our community. So the area was west of the Scioto River, which was great for industry. However, there was a lot of flooding. And so the area would flood, but they would rebuild every time, right? Well, in 1913, the Great Flood happened. And this was actually the most catastrophic natural disaster that Ohio has ever experienced. I was unaware of that as well. And so it happened so quickly, most people were caught off guard and died in their homes. It was very quick. It impacted a lot of the Midwest, but most specifically Dayton and Columbus. And so there were over 500 homes that were destroyed. People were unhoused. They didn't have the resources to rebuild. Some people lost everything. If you think there's nothing digital, like now, if my house got washed away in a flood, like my money's in the bank. All of my photos are on thumb drives. There are so many things I could recover because of the digital world that we live in. And that just wasn't the case then. So any sort of inheritance anyone had was in their house that then got washed away with the flood.
That's an interesting thought of like inheritance. Like I'm assuming we're leading into some generational wealth conversations, but to think about that today, if there's a disaster or something happens, it's not necessarily going to impact the wealth that you have and your ability to then share that with the generations to come. Like you don't have to worry about a natural disaster in some ways for especially wealthy people having any sort of impact on that.
Yeah, because you have investments, you have stocks now, you have all of these places because we've learned that keeping your money in your home isn't safe, and that if you are wealthy, you're not going to keep all of your money in a savings account where it's not making you more money. You're going to invest it. And so in so many ways, you're exactly right. Today, we would never have to think about some of the things that they did then when this happened. And so inheritance was one of those. So furniture, jewelry, money, clothes, everything. I don't know about you, but my step grandparents had furniture we weren't even allowed to sit on. And I grew up in this neighborhood I'm talking about. Like, those were things that people in poverty passed down. Like that furniture we didn't sit on because it was like family furniture and had plastic on it. And I know some people might be listening to this laughing like, yep, my grandma had the same thing.
Yeah.
Because you had what you had and you left that for your family. And if that all goes away, you then have nothing. So I can't imagine losing everything. And so it obviously injured people. It killed people. It injured them physically. But the psychological effects and the trauma that is caused from that is just, it was immeasurable. And then the roads and the bridges washed out. So then they were no longer able to even be rescued. And so it was just a really awful situation. Not only that, but their water became contaminated because the city's sanitation system was just overloaded. And so a lot of people got typhoid fever. So their homes were destroyed. they're stuck. My grandma just told me a story this weekend about people were climbing on the roofs of their homes, waiting on people to come through in boats to rescue them. The elementary school that I went to, when you walk in the front door, if you look up at the wall, really close to the ceiling, they always had a mark that said the flood of 1913 was here. And when you walked in and you look up and you're a kid and you think, water? Like water was here where I'm at right now. It's just a lot. So they dealt with these medical issues that then couldn't be treated. It was declared a public health crisis. It's actually a pretty significant piece of history, because then after this, they implemented a lot of measures to make sure that that didn't happen again. And they started really focusing on sanitation systems. We can see an example of that with Hoover, because the sanitation system at Hoover is like pretty incredible. It's self-sustaining. But this was huge in the history of the United States. So unsurprisingly, this caused businesses to leave the area. There was no investment. There's no healthcare. The schools are going down. I mean, you can see where we're going with this, right? The community deteriorated around itself. And then the Black community especially was really devastated, because they were the people living in these most undesired areas that were more prone to flooding. And so everyone's already at a disadvantage. They may have lost their entire family. They may have lost some family members. And so a lot of people started leaving, and they started going more west to higher ground, which now is known as the Hilltop. And so when my first house that I purchased was in the Hilltop when I was not even 30 years old. And so, it's still known as the Hilltop today. And so the working class were able to get away from the city and not deal with the bustling crowds, as well as the flooding and all of the things that can happen in low-lying areas. However, this area never recovered. So the automobiles became more popular, and then people were like, oh, well, now we can get way out of the city, and suburbs started to be built. And so something called white flight happened, and all the white people just started leaving, and they were just going to the suburbs. And so then the businesses and the development and the investment starts to happen in the suburbs, more west of the city of Columbus. And so this just really became a very desolate area. And so on a Wednesday at noon, on April 26, 1988, in a hospital room in Franklinton, I was born into this urban blight. Sounds fun, right?
Now, can you tell us, before you continue, a little bit about who already in your family lived in this area?
Yes. So my mom and my dad both lived in this area. So my mom was 23 when I was born. My dad was 27. They were married for 5 years at the time when they had me. Their marriage did not last long. Spoiler. But yes, my mom and dad lived in the area at the time. And in order to understand their relationship, or really the relationship between anyone in my story, you have to understand the history of how they came up in this area. And so I'm going to kind of talk about that a little bit. Kamala Harris recently said, you exist in the context of all in which you live and what came before you. And I just can relate to that so much, because one of my key takeaways has been just that. People are so important, and we all exist in the context of these stories. And if we just try to move on and be better than each other, we miss the why. And we miss, why is history repeating itself? Why do these patterns continue? And I spent my whole life just trying to be better than everyone else that was in that situation, until I finally stopped and was like, hold on, why is this happening?
Yeah.
Because I'm better, right? I'm better than this, but I'm still finding, Yeah, right.
You are that.
Right. And it's like,
you're not different than.
Yeah. So how can we can't be better, that we can't better we can't compete our way out of poverty.
Yeah.
I don't have to be better than everyone else. I just have to be me. And being me, hopefully, can help everyone else. But I was so focused on, like, I've got to be better than this.
Yeah.
And yeah, that got me a lot of things, but I was still sad and I was still dealing with the same patterns because I never looked at the why.
Yeah.
And the why really is in the stories and where they've been.
Were your grandparents in this area too? So
yep, and
your grandparents lived there too. So your parents grew up in that area. They were kind of born bred.
So I was able to. So my mom is the youngest of two. She has an older brother, and neither of them have the same father. My grandma grew up in this area. She was in her early 20s, so pretty young when she had both of her kids. She did meet my grandpa, who I would know as my grandpa eventually when my mom was very young and they would stay together. I was able to track my grandma's lineage back to when they first immigrated to Franklinton in 1876 from Canada. So they were immigrants. And so if we think about, 1796 to 1876, they were immigrants in this area that had been there for almost 100 years.
Right.
So immigrants, we know how we treat immigrants today, and it's historically happened, right? And so my family really grew up in these most undesirable areas because they were immigrants. They came from Ireland and Canada, and they just settled where they could settle. And so my grandma's mom died when she was 12 from uterine cancer. Go back to that lack of medical care, right? And so she was raised by her dad. An aunt moved in the house to help them, who was extremely mean to my grandma. She was one of 5 siblings, but she was the only girl. She was the youngest, so she suffered a lot of abuse at the hands of her brothers and her aunt. She tells stories of, like, the only clothes they had to wear being from charity newsies. I won't really go into too much of anyone else's trauma because I really think that that's their story to tell. But there are a few stories that really did impact me significantly that I think are important. And one of them really was my grandma telling me stories of how she was treated and how poor she was as a child. And so one story that always stuck with me is she never got any dolls, like for Christmas, birthdays, nothing. She was the only girl. She really always wanted a baby doll. And so one year close to Christmas, she found some gifts, I think, that had been hidden, and there was a doll in there, and she assumed it was for her, and she was really excited, and it wasn't for her. And so she tells the story of it's Christmas Day and everyone's opening gifts except for her. And the doll was like for a cousin or something. And so, she has lots of stories like that. And just like a lot of abuse. And this weekend I saw her and I asked her, did your dad talk a lot about the flood? Because he was only 1 when it happened. And she was like, no, he never talked about the flood. I'm like, well, if this doesn't track.
Well, I think that's an experience many people listening might have with their own family, with like the older generations of, like, you find out something when you're an adult about what happened to someone in your family. And then you're like, why have I never heard of this? And everyone's like, yeah, they just never talked about it. And you're like, what?
Yeah.
And I know we have a lot we want to get to today and cover, but I think one thing that's really important about the scene that you're setting right now is that as you get older, you find out that people bury and push down trauma so hard to quote unquote escape it and to move past it, but it always stays right there because it's never addressed.
Yep. When she said that, I said, I just can't, I still can't fathom it. He was one of 14 siblings. And he was 1 when the flood hit. There was nowhere you could have lived in Franklinton that you would not have been impacted. And to think that that was not ever a topic of conversation in their house is mind blowing to me. And also not, because what I realized was that this pattern would continue in my family for the rest of my life of just,
it was just another,
if we ignore it,
another bad thing that happened.
Exactly.
Bad things happening. So it's just the next sequence of being stuck in poverty, being stuck in an environment that you can't control, really. You don't have the funds to control it. You don't have the energy. You're barely getting your needs met. You know, there's a whole bunch of that it just is like, that's the next thing. Okay. Yeah. This is the next thing that we have to deal with.
You're so right. And I think what you just said, you're just used to bad things happening. And I think that at some point, you're so desensitized to that you don't even realize that some of those bad things are trauma. Like, that's not just a bad thing. You lost your whole home and your family. And it's like so many of that where people are just like, yeah, that happened.
Yeah.
And you're like, that's very traumatic. But it happened again because my grandpa, who my grandma married when my mom and uncle were very young, I came to know him as Papa, and I knew no different until one day we were having a cookout and my stepdad's brother randomly dropped the bomb that he was not my mom or uncle's biological dad. So I was a teenager when I found out that my grandpa was not my biological grandpa. Never talked about it again. Now we talk about it. Now that my grandpa's no longer here, we kind of openly talk about it. Not often, but it's a thing we know. Yeah. And we will mention, but never before then. And so there were a lot of instances in this where when a secret comes up and you are the person that finds out the secret, you're very brushed off. Like, as a teenager, I was very confused. I was angry because I felt like everyone was lying to me. And then I had so many questions like, well, who is your dad? And why don't you have the same dad? And just all of these questions naturally that you would have about your family members and wanting to know their story. And everyone's just like, yeah, we don't talk about that. And so there were so many things that you go to bring up, or I would go to bring up, and everyone's like, we don't talk about that. Don't ever bring that up again. But the part that was hardest for me was I spent a lot of time, like, my grandpa was my saving grace as a kid. And I would say my grandma was too. They really, for all of the trauma that my mom experienced as a child, at their action or lack of inaction, I had the opposite. They were, and I think we see this a lot with grandparents where they try to make up for maybe what they didn't give their kids, or I just think it's different too when you're older and then you see someone in someone else. Like, I'm sure a part of them saw my mom in me.
Also, when you know better, you do better. You know, and I will say, as a parent and now a grandparent, when you with the gift of age and wisdom, hopefully with age comes wisdom, not always, but hopefully, and with that you then become more knowledgeable about, oh, this is another opportunity, right? And it is also like reparenting. So, you know, it's a cool experience. But yeah, when you know better, you do better. Not because you're feeling bad necessarily because of what you did with your kid, just you saw.
You want to do better.
And even if you don't really necessarily, some people won't acknowledge it with their children. Anything that wrongdoing, lots of families, like you say, keep that hush hush. We don't talk about it. We're not going to talk about it, but I'm not going to necessarily apologize to you, but I'm going to do better. Mm-hmm. But the kid never really feels validated because they were never really apologized to. Or like, what are you doing? You didn't do that when I was a kid, right? Like, this resentment kind of builds. And
yeah, absolutely.
Please apologize to your children if you need to.
Yeah, and it's interesting you say that because there was definitely that dynamic. And I think my mom really loved the relationship that I had with my grandma and grandpa. But now that you say that, it's so true, because I know sometimes my mom would definitely be resentful and make comments about things that they did with me or for me or the way they treated me that was night and day different from her, because they were both alcoholics when she was growing up. And so she suffered a lot of abuse from them. Yeah. And so reconciling that, I think, was hard for her. And she's never not let me be with them, but I could just tell. But you mentioned something, I don't remember if it was the first or second episode, about a book that you're reading now because you have sensitive grandchildren. Mm-hmm. And I just thought, like, that's just so important, because one of the things that was most traumatic for me that I never realized was not being able to acknowledge my feelings. I mean, I got to a point as an adult where anger was the only feeling I could identify. Yeah. And every time I felt anything, it was anger. I was either angry, happy, or drunk.
Yeah. The Plus little girls were taught to be less emotional.
Oh, absolutely.
And I have shared that. And so, you should, your artwork that you have done that you brought with you today.
Yeah. Maybe you guys could take a picture and post that.
Yeah, we'll post it. But what it says, you guys, is dry it up. Stop crying, or I'll give you something to cry about. I've heard it.
Mm-hmm. Definitely heard of it.
You've definitely heard it. You've heard it. Like, I just feel like it's something that our parents' generation that's what they said, like, there's nothing to cry about. You're just being an emotional person. And we are meant to be emotional.
Yeah.
Women are meant to be emotional. And that's okay. It's okay for them to have their emotions. And I think it's great that my granddaughter's generation is now being taught, and I don't think I ever told my girls stop crying, or I will give you something to cry about. I don't think I ever repeated those words ever. Girls, you can tell me if I did. I don't think, as a young mom, possibly breaking those generational habits that we talked about, right? Because that's what I was told. I tried really hard not to be like that, but I'm sure there were some times that I wasn't the best mom to them, and I've told them such, right? So I think we get told that as girls a lot, and it's not necessarily about poverty as much as it is about girls are being told that.
Yeah,
and really not being able to figure out our emotions as a young child is a large part of our suffering as adulthood.
Yeah, I mean, all the money I've spent in therapy for someone to tell me my emotion because I can't name it. And I'm like, wow.
Yeah.
This is tough.
Yeah. You were taught to repress it. So my feelings don't matter.
And I know I'm jumping ahead a smidge, but it also is telling that then you became a teacher who really, really cared about giving kids a safe space to voice their emotions when other adults weren't listening, because you needed to heal that part of yourself. And I would love to know how, like, what your relationship was to your teachers in school, knowing kind of a little bit more now about, like, your familial situation. Like, how did you feel like that kind of started all of this for you?
Yeah. So I had a really good experience in school. I really leaned into school. It was something that I was good at. I was a people pleaser. I was a great listener. I mean, you do what you have to do, right, to survive. And so I had learned that if I make everyone around me as happy as possible, and if I am just as good as possible, everything's fine. Like, if I do everything the way I'm supposed to do, then we'll be okay here. I'll be happy, everyone else will be happy, and it'll all be okay. And so I just really leaned into that. And I had one teacher I had several teachers that were really impactful. But I had one who just played a huge role in my life. I was raised by my mom and stepdad. Mom grew up in very high poverty area. My stepdad grew up in this same neighborhood.
Okay.
He grew up in a very white supremacist, racist household. Very.
And with a huge propensity towards religious following to cult-like levels, if I may say so.
To put it this way, I was thinking about this today because because this kind of goes into when I decided I was going to be a teacher.
Okay.
It was this teacher, Miss Norman. She's now Mrs. Newman. She played a huge role in my life. And I actually never really thought I was going to grow up. I grew up with this belief that the rapture was going to come and I would never make it to adulthood.
God was going to save you. Jesus.
Maybe not. The way I was doing things, maybe not.
Yeah. Because I think I think this is really, really important. This is key because we've had conversations around people pleasing and imposter syndrome, and then also being a perfectionist. And you felt like literally to survive, and maybe not, you had to literally be perfect because of the severe religious undertones of everything growing up. Like this wasn't just like a normal or like what you see on TV, like, oh, we go to church every Sunday. Maybe, I'm going to hell. This was it was a fear instilled in you for control.
Yes. And it was a fear of going to hell, but it was more so a fear of the second coming of Christ.
Yeah.
I grew up with a very intense fear that at any moment the world was going to end, and it was going to end in a terrible way. And I was going to be a part of it, and my adulthood was going to be horrible. Like, I remember looking around and I almost didn't even have time to realize how poor we were and how in poverty we were, because it was like, well, Jesus is going to come anyway. And I don't know if that was just a way for everyone to be like, well, guess we better just sit here.
Yeah.
Like, I don't really know. I think a lot of it was control. And I know there are still people, I mean, my stepdad to this day doesn't know that I've deconstructed my religion, because I know that that's not a conversation I'm willing to have because of what he would like to come back with. But it is still very much, I mean, he told me 2 weeks ago, he's not going to get cremated now because nowhere in the Bible does it say anything about cremation. And I'm like, reconciling that is much easier for me as an adult than when I was a child being told, you can't have sex, you can't do this, you can't. I mean, just all of these things. I had to be so careful what I wore. I mean, purity culture impacted me. I mean, still impacts me today. And then to see the things that my parents did, because they were both alcoholics. And they wouldn't say that, they wouldn't call it that word, but I am an alcoholic, and I have a really dangerous relationship with alcohol, and I know one when I see one. And I'm going to say that they definitely
learned it from somewhere.
I learned it from somewhere, and they learned it from somewhere, and they learned it from somewhere. So, it's no surprise that then I grew up to have a very scary relationship with alcohol.
And it's also
escapism. It's escapism. Yeah. A lot of the poverty, right? Like everything's so desperate. And then you have the flood. It takes literally all of your things. And and this is something they're used to happening, right? So when you're in such poverty, you just don't have anything. So they just drink their faces off because I mean, what's going to happen in my life? Just more turmoil and more terrible things that are happening and more negativity. And I can't take it. So you know what? I can barely make bread, but I'm going to take this $20 and I'm going to go get smashed because I need to escape this reality for a while because it's brutal. You understand. Yeah. Doesn't make it easy as a child to deal with. Doesn't make it easy to understand once you're out of it. Like you can't understand why you're out of it, but why you're in it at that age, not. And you're told that, like, for example, there was a family, we had a corner store, as most do when they live in poverty, which I still am amazed that if you don't live in poverty, you don't stay corner store. Like we have a gas station on our corner. And I so bad want to call it a corner store every time, but it's not. But there was a couple that would always sit outside there. They were like the sweetest couple. And
the guy would be honest every time. He's like, look, I got food, but I really want to go get me a 40.
Yeah.
And, you know, I'm like, same. And I'm 15. No, I didn't drink when I was 15 because second coming of Christ. I was like, I can't be drunk when Jesus gets here.
Yeah. Well, it's also no surprise then that you would take school as such like a safety spot for yourself, because it's probably the only time you got away from some of those scary situations that you encountered, especially when alcohol was involved.
I heard a lot of this like hateful, racist, misogynistic, anything non-Christian was bad. I mean, this was not just Christian. This was Christian nationalism. Let's be clear.
Yeah.
Like that's what this is. Of you must be afraid of everything else in the world that is not God or related to God in some way. And if you don't want to know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
So anything that was non-white, non-heteronormative was awful. I mean, hateful rhetoric. And so I get to school. My first grade teacher is a Black woman. And she would be my teacher for first grade, second grade, and third grade. So I was fortunate enough to have Miss Norman as a teacher for 3 years. And I can honestly say that changed my life. She changed my life, because that's when my dream of being a teacher really took flight. She wasn't just a good teacher. I mean, I'll be honest, I don't know if she was a good quote unquote teacher. I don't know. I don't know if she taught me math. I don't know if she taught me reading. I don't know.
You remember how she made you feel?
Yeah, it doesn't matter either, because it doesn't matter what she taught me, because what she taught me was that I was good enough as I was, and that I could be okay. Like I just knew, she just gave me this feeling of like, it's going to be okay.
I can totally relate, by the way. That I grew up very poor. We were on welfare my entire my entire youth. I was on welfare, and school was my safe space. It was where I could shine, and I was just, of course, I did all the overachieving that one does, and I could just I knew I was going to eat there, even though I was embarrassed about the fact that I had free lunch, because that wasn't the norm where I was everywhere. Not everybody had that, but I did, and so I could get something to eat if I needed to, and everybody treated me the same there. It's kind of a leveling field, right? That I felt normal there. I didn't feel unsafe. I didn't feel like somebody's drinking was going to. That's where your people pleasing comes in, and is when people drink. We've talked about this. They don't become the best versions of themselves, right? And so it's an unsafe environment for a child.
And you don't realize that as a kid. You don't know what alcohol does to someone's mind. Right. So all you see is this person you know and love behaving in a way that doesn't, and it doesn't show love and care. It's like the exact opposite.
Well, it makes you feel unsafe. I'm unsafe now. Like that, you're my person who's supposed to be keeping me safe, and you're clearly not in a place that's keeping me safe. So it creates, whether it's intentional or not, it creates a very unsafe environment for a child, and it doesn't ever have to result in physical abuse or verbal abuse. It's just neglect. Your child is left in a neglectful state when you're intoxicated in front of them. They just feel unsafe, and I know that would be a harsh thing to hear for some parents, but that's how it makes children feel.
Yes.
And so then we become people pleasers, because you just want to see if everybody's safe, So if you're people pleasing and they're jovial and they're laughing even though they're joking, you feel a little more safe in that environment. So then you that's a learned behavior that you're starting to do, right? And so
humor is a big one too. Yeah. Like you said, oh, they're laughing.
Yeah. And I grew up in a fundamental Baptist family. Same thing, you're going to die, you're going to go to hell, we're never going to make it because you think about having sex. Well, clearly it was
God
never
knows.
taught to me, right? It was never taught to me that this is normal and your body's normal and you should be having these thoughts because your hormones are raging. Like, nobody ever explained what was happening to your body. It was just, you should absolutely not do that. It is forbidden. You will go to hell. what?
About everything. I mean, there were so many things.
Void of like, oh my God, I'm definitely going to have. Because this is all I think about right now, because, my hormones are then it's the craziest stuff. And coming out of that has been a lifelong process. And I had one teacher in high school, and I'll never forget it, because fundamental Baptists, for any of you who don't know, believe in, that the earth was really created in 7 days, and that, they can't account for the dinosaurs, and nobody wants to talk about it. It doesn't fucking matter. And science is not considered in any way. And her name was Dr. Leff, and she was old then, so I looked her up, and I can't find her. I'm pretty positive that she's dead now, but the most awkward, weird lady that you'd ever met in your whole life. She was short. She looked like a witch. No, I mean, like, for real, probably was a witch. Long gray hair, super straight, straggly, the straightest polyester pants you've ever seen in your whole life, the most orthotic shoes you could ever think of.
You're really selling this lady.
Never smiled, the most ugly shirt, and I adored her.
I love that.
And she shuffled in the hallway, just scooching her feet, and she was hunched over, so she's got a hunchback on top of that. Like, but she taught all the most fascinating classes, and she taught a religion class that I took, and it was her that was, I would say, the person who started my awakening all of those years ago.
And you saying that, it just gives me chills, because if you look at what's happening in our country right now, people are trying to take away the ability for kids to be told the truth.
Or a different version of the truth, right? Even if you don't believe that it's the truth. And we talked about this earlier today. Points of view are literally a point.
Yeah.
And they're correct for everyone. And it's going to be based on your experience and based on your exposure. And not two people can have the same experience, even being in the same spot and experiencing the same event. You can ask them, and the way they interpret it and the way they experience it are totally different. Their points of view are totally different. Experiencing the same thing. It has been tested and reviewed over and over again. So it's a fascinating thing to think that your point of view, it can be expounded on, right? And her words to me was like, well, what if a day to God was millions of years here on earth? I was like, the earth slowed down in that moment. Like, it slowed down. Her words were coming at me really slowly, and my whole world just like, boom.
Yeah.
Like, exploded. I get cold chills every time I think about it, because I had never in my indoctrination been given an opportunity to think outside of that box. And I'll never forget her for that. And by the time I really understood the impact of that moment in my adulthood, I couldn't find her. So she had probably passed away at that point. But man, I wish I'd been able to tell her that, because she has no idea. And I'm like, how many other people? You know? And I think this for us and everybody on a daily basis. I think about it in my children's hospital career. How one thing that you do every day that you may not have even noticed or known about change somebody else's life and experience forever.
Right.
That's a cool thing to think about, right? To think, wow, I impacted somebody in such a way that it impacted them for the rest of their days.
Right.
What a blessing. And carrying yourself in such a way every day that that's a good thing and not a bad thing. Yeah. Right? Because that can also go the other direction, right? Is that you change somebody's life for the worse for the rest of their lives.
Yeah.
It can be an innocuous statement. It can be what you think is something flippant and it's not. And especially to children, right? It can be something that sticks with them for the rest of their days. And it was a total innocuous statement to you that you wouldn't even thought twice about.
Right.
But the teachers are powerful and important. So
yeah. And lucky for my favorite teacher, I do know where she is, and you know me. So we were texting this weekend. But I'm working on a memoir right now, and I know we'll mention this at the end of the episode, but I did want to just read a little passage about Miss Norman, because I think it just gives a peek into kind of how I was feeling, what was going on, and then how that translated into me being a teacher. I was fortunate enough to have my favorite teacher, Miss Norman, for 3 years as a first, second, and third grader. It was within the walls of her low-budget classroom that I would find solace. In her presence, I felt attended to. I would grow to love school, and I have fond memories of many teachers who have had a positive impact on my life, but none quite like the GOAT. It is because of her love, care, attention, and sincerity in some of the darkest and most confusing days that she was totally unaware of that I chose to become a teacher. This career path and many other positive choices and actions have allowed me to move away from the impoverished environment that surrounded me as a child and work to heal the generational trauma that plagues me. Miss Norman provided me with a strong foundation that would set me on a path of success. She laid the groundwork for what would be a lengthy and impressive academic career. This foundation, paired with the experiences and knowledge I gained along the way, saved me from a life of poverty. Now I shorten this idea to school saved me. And then more specifically, Miss Norman saved me. I know the power of education because of the power it has had in my life. I know the power of a trusted adult because of the power one had in my life. I know the power of love because of the power it had over me. I drank it up like a drug and then vowed I would pass it out like candy at Halloween, even when the kids didn't dress up or say trick or treat. And I can honestly say I have followed through.
I love that. It's beautiful.
That's beautiful.
So that was, I never, the only thing I ever talked to her about that was personal or that I thought was giving her a peek into my life was that my dad wasn't really very present when I was younger. And so she didn't have a dad that was around a lot either. Her mom was a single mom. And so we really bonded through that. But, at the time as a kid, I didn't realize that we were poor. I didn't realize I was experiencing trauma. It was just my life. So neither of us really knew.
Yeah.
And that's what I think about that as a teacher. Every time a kid walks in my room, I don't know what they just went through. And I think about that every time a kid walks in my room. I will never greet a kid with anything other than hello, their name, how are you, glad to see you. I don't care if we're giving a test and a kid walks in my room. Like, I never want to make a kid feel like they can't come and talk to me because of the way I might react or that I might push them away. And so I really leaned into that and letting kids feel their feelings. And, at the beginning, I have not always been like that. Even going through all of this trauma, it wasn't until then I started to learn about it that I knew to do better. It wasn't like, I was like, oh my gosh, I've been through this hard life. This was just my life. I just started going to therapy in 2019, and I thought I was going to therapy for anxiety that developed it's funny now. I think back and she goes, oh, so how was your childhood? And I'm like, oh yeah, I had a great childhood. And now I'm looking back and I'm like, okay, I was very disassociated in 2019.
We just talked about this earlier. That's the power of storytelling, because it is so easy to think everything you personally experienced was totally cool, totally normal, not a big deal. And then listening to other people tell their stories or healing yourself and going through a therapist, which your only job is to talk. That's why that is powerful, because it unlocks all these things that you can then reflect on and say, oh my God, that did happen to me. This is a big deal. This did cause me to be a certain way. And, I think that's one of the things I admire about you most as a teacher is, and I would love for you to talk about a little bit, is like what they tried to force you or what was expected of you as a teacher in today's society and standards versus how you wanted to show up.
Yeah, I think that's something that a lot of teachers struggle with, sometimes for different reasons. I have a real problem when words don't match actions. And so many school districts, schools, teachers, administrators, anyone involved in education, you will hear a common phrase that students are first. We always put students first. We do what's best for students, student-centered. If you go into an interview, even now, people would say, just make sure all your answers are student-centered. And I find it funny because it's so untrue at the highest level. I mean, if you look at all of the legislation, it's not student-centered. It's centered around this idea of what we deem students need to do to be successful. And it's what we deem as a society is important. Are they going to be ready for the workforce? Are they going to be, workforce development is now, you go on any school website and do a Control F and search workforce development. Count how many of them there are. And if there are 0, try job training, because it is everything. And I'm not saying that's not important. However, we all know there are many things that impact how you show up in the workforce that has nothing to do with your academic resume. Mm-hmm. And there is such a focus. And I taught in a very affluent district more recently, and the focus on achievement is at a cost that people don't even realize what they are paying. And
tell us more about that, though.
They're paying it in their kids' mental health.
Yep.
And they don't even realize it. And then what's even more mind-blowing is that when you bring it up, people look at you like you have 3 heads. One thing about me, if you don't know me, is that I don't speak on things I don't know about. I have always loved to be the expert and feel like the expert. It's funny because that's a huge part of my human design. I'm a projector. I lived my life as a manifesting generator. Up until recently. If you know anything about human design, or even if you don't, a projector, and I'm very new. So again, I don't speak on things that I don't know 100% about, which is also a characteristic of a projector, because I feel like I have to have all these facts and all these pieces of data and knowledge to be able to prove a point. As a kid, that was hard because I grew up in a family that the adults wanted to be the expert. And not so much my mom, but definitely my stepdad and his family were very much like, shut up, kid. Nobody asked you. Maybe not out loud, but
that was a sentiment.
Yes. Everyone was smarter than me because I was a kid.
Not heard.
Yep. And I was a kid. And so at the end of the day, anything I had to say didn't really matter because I was a kid. And I think a lot of people still really treat kids that way. I think teachers do it. I think administrators do it. I think parents do. And I saw something, and when I worked at the middle school, this was really hard for me because, man, middle school kids are quirky and weird, and I love everything about it because I am too.
They're figuring their own stuff out.
They are.
It's the very beginning.
And everybody else's stuff too.
Yeah.
And mine. And, everybody's. But I loved it because I was like, look, we're all just going to be weird together. Like, let's just be weird. And, there was a kid that loved to sit under the desk and read during study center. And some of the other kids would be like, what's he doing under there? I'm like, he's being him. And that's what we do in here. And if you don't want him to be him, you can go. And they're like, well, fine. And I'm like, well, I'm not worried about what he's doing. I'm worried about what I'm doing. You should try it.
Yeah.
But it's just so much of that. And the kids feel that way because they hear it. Everything they do is questioned. Well, why are you doing that? Why are you doing that way? And I especially see it in mathematics just because of the journey my career has taken me. I've done professional development in mathematics. I've spent the last 10 years researching how kids best learn math.
You've also won a national award for math.
I did win the Presidential Award for Excellence in Math and Science Teaching in 2020 for the focus on math teaching. And the thing that I really latched onto about how kids best learn math is this idea that it's open. Like math is so open and it's such a beautiful subject and it's so intricate. And there are so many different ways you can approach it and strategies and ways you can solve problems and the patterns you can see. And in Western culture, we treat math as if it is a series of facts to be memorized. And that happens in all of education. And so I think me honing in on math allowed me to see how this was happening in so many different areas. And it's this control, because as soon as what I learned through all of the research and all the workshops I have been a part of and then led, is that as the teacher, if you give up the control to have to know everything and be everything and answer everything, that's when the kids really start to learn. And that's when your job's going to be the most fun and maybe not the easiest, but it's going to be much easier for the kids when they're not being forced to just regurgitate stuff. And that is so much of what education is right now, is just rote memorization, regurgitation, achievement, test scores, getting into college, AP classes.
It's taking the ability to problem solve and to be joyful in the learning process completely away, which then creates adults in the workforce who are not able to be creative with solution making and goes directly to their boss and say, what do I do now? And then guess what happens? That boss gets pissed off that they have a bunch of employees that come to them and they just want the answer. Whatever happened to common sense and problem solving? Whatever happened to critical thinking? Well, let me tell you what's happening. Ask any teacher what's happening about that, because they've been now in school to get a certain test score, to get into a certain college, to then be in the workforce that they've trained their whole education for, but now equal adults who literally cannot problem solve because they were never taught. They were trained to memorize something or to memorize a curriculum or to do something to score a certain way.
And those kids probably got a 34 on their ACT.
100%. And they were told they were successful. So now they're in the workplace and you're telling them as a boss that they're not problem solving by themselves, and it's frustrating and they need to do better, and then they don't, and then they get fired. So really, I know this is like
I have a really good stat for this too, because I've been really looking into math acceleration, because a lot of districts now are really pushing math acceleration, and that is a topic for another podcast because my soapbox for that is immense. However, the one stat that really, I was like, this says it all. Kids are taking algebra 1 in higher numbers in college than they are in high school, because kids are taking algebra 1 in 7th grade. And then they get to college and they cannot test into the math they need to, because they didn't actually learn algebra 1 in 7th grade, because actually kids shouldn't be learning algebra 1 in 7th grade. And so then they go to college and now they're taking algebra 1 again. But man, when they were a 7th grader, they were the coolest kid in school because they were in the highest math you can get in. The number of times I have had kids tell me they are in the dumb math class is ridiculous. Yeah. And it is. And the thing that you said, you asked me, what was I forced to do, or what was I forced to focus on? And I think the thing that I realized was that no one was ever going to have an honest conversation about what was really happening, because that would force us to look at some of the things we were doing that wasn't best for kids. And if we had to actually look at that, then we'd have to admit that something we're doing is wrong, and that creates cognitive dissonance. And then we have to figure out, how do we do it the best way? But this way is already getting good test scores.
Yeah.
So we're not going to do all that.
Yeah.
Because we're getting the results that we want. because the state tells us this is what we want.
They're just
this
not
is
testing anxiety levels
No.
or mental health acuity things. They're not looking at any of them.
And they want scores that identifies them as high performing schools.
Exactly. Because then people move into their district. It affects real estate.
And then you get students who are suffering because their poor parents are doing everything that they can to get them into a better school district.
Yep.
And that is causing so much financial stress and everything else to those parents who just want a better education for their children.
Yep. And what's really sad is then those kids are going to go to a quote unquote better school district. And the gap and disparity is going to be so much greater. The array of students that would come into my classroom, I mean, the diversity was there. And I mean diversity in interests and everything from top to bottom. People didn't like that. People did not like that students would come into my room because then they would miss 5 minutes of class. And it became a real thing. It became a real problem to the point that I had people asking me about things they saw on camera, which told me that people were literally watching the camera to see who was going in and out of my room. And everything was very punishment driven, as I think it is often in middle school and high school. Mm. And whenever I would just try to present a new idea or a reason why, because I'm the type of person, and this is why I think it's best that I ended up leaving the classroom, because if you ask me not to do the right thing, I'm still going to do the right thing, even if you're my boss. Like if you ask me not to allow kids to do XYZ, and I know that that's what they need to do for themselves, oh, they're doing XYZ, I'm just going to shut my door.
Yeah.
Because that's what I need to do for kids. And I know that because someone did it for me.
Right.
I didn't just read a book about it. You know, I didn't just,
you
lived
have the lived
it.
experience.
Yeah. And so I got really frustrated with pretending, with just, and it got really bad because, and this is how I knew it was bad, because anything that would be brought up about school ever, and I feel like it's still like that now, my mind, and this is the projector in me, my mind goes to big picture what's happening.
So what was your last straw? What made you say and maybe talk about your new position a little bit, but what was kind of the last thing that you said, I just need to exit the classroom?
So it was actually a longer road than it seems because COVID happened. And then I went on special assignment for 2 years. So I worked for a nonprofit and I got to develop curriculum and I got to go into schools and lead workshops. And it was something I had done previously on a contract basis, but then they were able to get me on special assignment. So I was still technically with a school district, but I reported to this other job for 2 years. And then the district brought me back just because there was a position open that I could fill and they didn't want to hire someone. So they brought me back, and I have a video of the day before I went back and I'm sobbing because I just felt I really don't even know how to explain it. When you said right now you feel so heavy, I just felt really heavy. I just felt heavy. I think it's because I knew how much it's a lot.
Yeah.
It's a lot when you don't have the ability to separate. It's so personal to me. Teaching is personal. Kids are personal. I can't just go home and turn it off. And when I was on special assignment for 2 years, I had gotten a really good work-life balance. I kind of went through an identity crisis because COVID hit and then kids went home, and then I kind of built my whole identity on being a teacher. I mean, you know me, I was constantly in my classroom or staying late. And when I didn't move back to Columbus yet, when I was in Tiffin, I would just stay in my classroom until 8 p.m. because what else was I going to do? I didn't have family there. I didn't really, I just worked. And so I told myself, like, I can't do that, because I realized at that point I had been going to therapy and I was on anxiety medication. So I realized I had been giving too much of myself. Now I was still heavily drinking at this point. So I was also hungover a lot and didn't realize it. I guess not hungover. I was feeling the effects of alcohol, because what I realized was that was not a hangover. That was the residual effects of constantly having alcohol in my system. And I didn't realize the effect that was playing on like my mood and my mental health, and that, you can't drink when you are on anxiety and ADHD medicine, because you will black out immediately. So I go back in the classroom just feeling really heavy. Within a week, I was back up to my elbows in dirt. Like, I'm all in. Well, my husband coaches football. I would plan it so that I would get home at the same time he did after football practice. So I would stay after school an additional 3 hours sometimes. And he's calling me and he's at home and he's like, how come you're not home? And here I am again, slipping back into this high achieving teacher. Like, I have to be the best, not because I want to be the best, but because being the best I am, I've learned, means being the best, right? So like, I gotta do that. So I start just slipping right back in. And I mean, it got to a point, I was crying daily. And I will say part of it was just because of the overwhelm of, I taught second grade, and when you're not in a good place with your own mental health, I knew the importance of me supporting those kids in the way that was effective, like the way I needed to, and I physically couldn't, but I was giving all that I could to them. And then I would get home and I was just like, I had nothing, and I would just drink immediately. I mean, it got to where I was walking in the door from work, and before I had my shoes off, I was opening a beer.
Yeah.
And I'm a teacher, so I was done at like 3:30. So Amanda, you read tarot, and I was like, you had already stopped drinking, but we were obviously still friends. And so I was like, you knew I was going through this stressful time. And I was like, can we just meet and have a tarot reading? I really am thinking that like I need to leave the classroom, but I don't know what I would do. I just felt really stuck because I had believed for so long that the only way I could make the impact that I wanted to make on kids was as a teacher in the classroom. And so I met with you, and, we had a reading and we talked, and you said to me, I was talking about a career choice and like, how am I going to then make an impact? But my whole conversation was really about like, so then if I quit, like, this matters though. What am I going to do? I can't just do something that doesn't matter. And you said to me, you are the journey. It's you. You can do whatever you want, because it's you that you need to focus on, not someone else. And I was like, what? Like, it's funny now thinking about it because it's such a simple statement, but I was really like,
you were trying to change the world.
I was like trying to change the world. And I honestly thought that the only way I would be able to is like, oh, I have to win an award if people are going to listen to me. I have to do this. I have to do that. I have to have this experience. I'm telling you, I'm not trying to toot my own horn, but my resume is impressive, honey.
Yeah.
But it's because I lived my life to build it.
Yeah.
I was living my life to build a resume.
Yeah.
And when you said that to me, I was like, oh, like maybe my life isn't about my job. But I had connected my job with money, and money is life and death.
For where you grew up.
Yes.
In your situation. And, that's That's exactly this full circle moment that we always have on these episodes, is you realize you do everything based upon your fears and dreams and hopes as a child.
Mm-hmm.
And you did all of this to get out of a community in a situation that you thought that you were better than, that you could work your way out of, to realize, oh God.
Yeah, I was like, this is interesting, because I found myself, and just to give a little bit of a backstory of what exactly was kind of happening and why I felt so much turmoil. Like, I own a house, and my husband and I live together. We just got married, but we weren't married then, but we were living together. We split all the bills. That was great. I also still own a house in Franklinton that family members are living in, and I was not getting enough money to cover that residence.
Right.
I had also purchased a vehicle for someone in my family and spent thousands of dollars and signed that over to them. And I mean, I did a lot of things. I was in an MLM and got myself in like $30,000 of credit card debt. Don't do that. But it was just a lot of things, and a lot of things that I had been taught were shameful. Getting in debt is shameful. You should be smarter than that. Like anything, I was raised that anything that happens to you is exactly that. It happens to you, but you let it. And I had to and I'm still working on it, when something goes wrong in my life, not going straight to, well, where did I go wrong? Like, sometimes things just happen.
Yeah. Yeah. What can I learn from it and move forward?
Yeah. And I was always trying to pinpoint like that it was a behavior that I needed to change. And it's like, no, sometimes, but not always.
Yeah, totally.
And when I met with Sarah about human design, my human design financially, because I'm actually getting ready to sell that house. And it's a huge decision, because like my grandma's lived there for 40 years. My grandpa, who passed away in 2006, put a lot into that house. And I just, especially with all the history, it's just been a really big choice.
Yeah.
But what I realized was that I had been putting so much certainty into money. Like, I thought that money was what was going to take this feeling of scarcity away, or certainty. But I have enough money that I am not worried I'm not going to eat tomorrow, for example.
Or pay your house.
Or pay my rent. Or yeah, I have done that. However,
your basic needs are met.
My basic needs are met.
Yeah.
I am not worried about my basic needs being met anymore.
Yeah.
However, I thought that I was getting that from money, but I still have all of those same feelings when I have my basic needs met and I have money and I am secure. And I was looking for, how can I monetize this? How can I do that? And trying to do all these things with money. And my biggest healing came when I just focused on myself, healing myself, leaning into my human design, and showing up. Like, projectors are really not supposed to work as much as other people. And I always just thought, why is this so hard for me? And I know Haley talked about imposter syndrome. I have felt like a huge imposter my whole life, because I was like, I am manipulating the shit out of these people. They think I'm so smart. They think like this is so easy for me. And I'm like dying inside.
Yeah.
Like, I thought, like, I wonder why this is so hard for me.
Yeah.
And it was because I was showing up in a way that just didn't make sense for me.
Yeah. Totally.
And I've been so much more productive since I started really leaning into, when do I work best?
Yeah.
And what's unfortunate about that is, what I've seen is so many students who have the same kind of struggles that I did and do. Because let's be honest, I mean, some of the stories kids would tell me are so relatable. I mean, if you have not talked to a teenager lately, talk to a teenager. If you cannot relate to what they're saying, you're probably pretending that you can't, because you feel some kind of shame. Because teenagers just say stuff and you're like, yeah. And it almost could take me right back to that place. Everything was fear-based. anything I did or did not do, I did based on fear. You can see on my little art here, fear is like the main word. So I didn't get pregnant before I was 18, fear. Didn't have sex before I was 18, fear. I was not this good person, quote unquote, right? I wasn't doing that because of the feeling it gave me inside. It was because I was afraid. And we have so many kids that have some of those same feelings, and they're showing up in this place every day, and they need to really have those feelings affirmed, and they need to feel like they can go to someone. Because if you feel like something you did is enough that could get someone hurt. I mean, I'm talking really, there were times where things happened that I was afraid to tell my stepdad because I thought he will kill someone.
Yeah.
Like and that's not even a joke. Like there are so many things. So I had a boyfriend in 8th grade, which I was not allowed to have a boyfriend in 8th grade. My parents were very, very strict. I was not allowed to talk to a boy on the phone until I was 14. I did do a little sneaking around on the phone because I did have, we had an alarm system and I had alarms on my bedroom windows. So I couldn't even open my bedroom windows. And when I was home alone, this is why I am also very passionate about gun control. My stepdad would tell me that while I was home by myself in the summer as a teenager, the way I would be most safe is if I carried around our 38 millimeter gun all day long to every room that I went into. So think about, I could have shot my mom. I could have shot yourself. A family member. I could have shot myself. I could have fallen. You know how clumsy I am? I could have fallen down the steps. I mean, so many things could have happened. But that same time period, I had a boyfriend in 8th grade. He had grown up in poverty. He had a lot of trauma, a lot of generational trauma. He had been like in a boys' home. My household was very racist. And I grew up being told, like, you will not date, you will be married to a white man. Like, that was an understanding. You will never date someone who's not a white man. And so I never really dated anyone up until that point, even like playfully, because I always seemed to connect with Black boys. And I knew, like, I wasn't gonna even go there because why would I do that to you? Why would I do that to me?
Yeah.
Like, we're not, and so I latch onto this boy, and it was I knew at the time this wasn't good. I mean, I hid it from my parents. I would like call him, and
was he white?
He was white. And he was already at this point like into drinking, smoking weed, smoking cigarettes. His mom was a single mom. She worked a lot, so he kind of just ran the streets. I was never allowed to like even really walk anywhere, and I was so afraid that I stayed home by myself summers from 8th grade on. I never one time allowed someone to come into our house that wasn't allowed to be there.
Yeah.
And I think part of it was because I knew deep down if anything happened to me, it would be my fault.
Yeah.
Like it would be, well, why did you? It wouldn't just be a kid doing a kid thing.
Right.
It would be like, well, look, there you went and ruined your life. Are you happy? It's just, that was the understanding.
Yeah.
And so,
I mean, in some ways, from a parental standpoint, you did live in a pretty risky neighborhood.
Oh, absolutely.
Right? I will put it politely, right?
Yes.
Like you lived in a very scary neighborhood, really. Mm-hmm. And so in some ways your parents were trying to protect you.
Yes.
Right? Like you just have to be aware that we are not in a safe environment. You do not go outside, and even in the house I want you to have a gun, because that's the environment outside that you kind of.
And that's what they knew.
Yeah.
That's what they knew.
Yeah. Right. My stepdad still sits with a gun beside him in the house.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he lives in the country now. And it's like, wow. But it's this fear. It's so much. And you're exactly right. And I always think like they did what they knew how to do.
Right.
Because that's what was done with them. And actually, it's not even what was done with them, because they did better than their parents.
Also, they did the best they could.
They absolutely
did.
Did.
Like that's what I go back to all the time is our parents, and as parents, you do the best you can with what you have at the time. And sometimes you're not the most conscious human to be the conscious parent. You're not the Mother Teresa, right? I have a temper and I'm tired and I'm working and and you have, and then there's the alcohol problem, right?
Yeah.
You throw poverty, alcoholism, and all of the things into a pot. And you come out with really scared children who lived a traumatized life, not because it was intentional of the parents.
Yeah.
It was not an intentional doing. It's just that environment was unsafe, and it leads to traumatic childhood events. And the way you come out of that is scared of everything and
I even wrote
people pleasing and manipulating your environment, controlling your environment. It manifests in a whole bunch of different ways depending on who you are. Control, manipulation, right? People pleasing, all of the things leads down to the, like, what were you good at to control your environment? And you were scared because you weren't safe.
Yeah. Because that's how we learn to operate.
Yeah. And so you're working on a memoir right now. So can you go ahead and share a little bit about the process and where you are with that memoir and like what kind of inspired you? Maybe it was this not this specific conversation, but
I'm like, I actually just started it right now. So I have always been like, I want to write a book. I love to write. I think one thing I realized when I quit drinking and really like got back to, which that's another plot twist. I forgot to say that, like, after you said that I am the journey, you told me to take action for 30 days. And so I, in my do all the things headspace, went to applying for jobs. So like mad, I applied for jobs for like 30 days. But within that 30 days, I also did end up giving up alcohol and have not drank since. And that really changed my life completely. And so I had always been like, I want to write a story. I want to write a book. I always thought it'd be about something else. But I finally just decided, like, I'm going to go from I want to write a book to like, I'm writing a book.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like a compilation of a lot of different things, but mostly like what we talked about here and kind of how that impacted me in the world of education and where we can go and what we can do for kids and communities moving forward, I think is really important. Because like you said, they did the best they could with what they had. And what makes me so angry about that is they should have had more. Yeah. Because this community was left to decay hundreds of years ago. And I can't do anything about that.
Today.
Yeah, and it's still happening today. And I said this to my husband as we were talking about selling this house. I said, it makes me so sad because my grandpa passed away. My grandma has just sat and watched this house deteriorate around her. And then I thought, oh my gosh, on a bigger scale, she's watched that her whole life. Like, this is just that pattern repeating. One thing that is, I do think I did dodge a bullet in there. So the boyfriend that I was telling you about that I dated in middle school, and it's interesting. I bring this up because I recently met with Sarah about my human design, and she brought up like when I was 14, the age of being 14. And she just said, was that like an important time in your life? I'm like, well, actually kind of. I dated this boy and then, we broke up, but we kind of still stayed in touch a little bit. And it wasn't a time of cell phones. Like I had a cell phone my senior year, but I was a friend in college. No one could text because I didn't even have texting. So we kind of kept in touch. And then my senior year, we got back in contact. And at this point, he was pretty like, he had dropped out of school by this point. I mean, I knew like this wasn't going anywhere and I was getting ready to leave for college, but I had been dating someone and he cheated on me. And so then, this other guy comes back into my life. And I mean, he's a grown man at this point because he's not in school. He's living on his own.
Yeah.
And so we reconnected, and I wouldn't say we were dating by any means, but my parents certainly didn't know we were like communicating again. And he showed up to like one of my softball games, but He is in prison now for murder. Actually, the time that we reconnected around my senior year, we were talking, and then all of a sudden, like, I just quit hearing from him, and I was like, this is so strange. Like, he just quit calling me. And then I randomly, our house phone kept getting all of these calls from correctional facility, and I have a cousin who's been in and out of prison my whole life, so we just assumed it was him, but the person didn't say their name. Like, it usually says you have a collect call from the blank correctional facility from, and then they say their name. If you've never had to hear that call, congratulations. But there was no name. And so I'm like, the heck, but I kind of knew, like, I was like, that's gotta be him. So one day my parents weren't home and I just answered it, and it was him. And he was in prison, for armed robbery, and he got 7 years. 7 years. He got 7 years. And we started communicating again. And he wouldn't call me, but now that I knew it was him, he would 3-way call me. So he would call someone, and then they would call me, and then they would hang up. And then we actually were, my senior year, like, talking while he was in prison, and my parents didn't know. And then he wrote me, I don't know how. I mean, who knows? Maybe they did know. Like, my stepdad's been to jail. I mean, I don't think they would have been like, yeah, write this guy a letter in prison, but it also wouldn't have been shocking if we knew someone who was in prison. And so we wrote each other back and forth, like, maybe a couple times. I think I only wrote him twice, and I was in high school. So I'm still like, I still felt this, how I feel for my students, like, or anyone. Yeah, I need to help him. And also, like, he didn't have a fighting chance. I think about my story and then multiply that. I mean, he had so much trauma. And so we communicated. Well, then he gave my address to someone else in prison, and that kind of ended that. So some random guy who was at this time like an adult, like a whole adult that didn't even know me, wrote me a letter. And then I basically, like, he called me on 3-way, and I was like, look, you can't, this is bad. Like, my stepdad's so upset, and I'm like in trouble. And he wrote me a threatening letter basically, and was like, I get out in this year, like, gave me the year, and was like, most people mistake my kindness for weakness. And I'm a senior in high school, right? I never told my parents because I was so scared that, like, this was my fault. I interacted with this person. Mm-hmm. I wrote this person a letter. Like, all I could think was, oh my God, if they find out I wrote him a letter and sent him a picture, like, this is all my, like, all I could think was, if he leaves prison and kills me, I don't have anyone else to blame but myself. Like, that, I thought that for so many years. And then finally, the year before he mentioned in the letter, I realized I should probably tell my parents, because at this point I'm now a teacher, and I lived 2 hours away from Columbus on my own. And so I was like, so I have to tell you guys this. And I gave them the letter, and it became like a thing in my life. And then he ended up getting out, and like 5 years later found me on Facebook. He like sent me a message. It was a whole thing. And like, I just blocked him and made my social media really private. But then in 2017, a girl went missing in Columbus. And after about a week or so, it came out that it was him. He was the father of her child, and he is now in prison for 25 years to life for her murder. And yeah, it's very scary.
But you're surrounded by sort of those,
and I think
it could have happened at any point, right? I think about that, and I'm like, wow. And I look at where I was brought up to where I am now, it's not just financially, but educationally, emotionally, all the things,
spiritually.
So I've come so far, but a lot of people never get out.
No,
they never get out.
No,
and a multitude of reasons, right? But beliefs and lack of support, lack of finances, all the things. There's just so much they become indoctrinated in not just in religion, but in culture.
Absolutely. It's that culture.
Your cult, right? Your clan is your cult. And so clan indoctrination, right? Your family indoctrination is so strong, especially in indigenous populations. Like you identify with them so greatly is that you can't identify outside of that in any way. And so it keeps them in this sort of
when I meet someone else who grew up in poverty, or it is like, I don't know, it's just this connection, or like I hear this story about someone or they say something and I'm just like, I get you. And like, it's hard to understand that if you're not in that. And, you know, dating someone who would have been in prison is not something that I ever thought like, oh, I won't ever do that.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, because people make choices. And also there are people in prison right now who didn't do a damn thing. So, you know, there's a lot of, you know, you can make a lot of assumptions about the conversation we're having. But at the end of the day, I was dating someone who was doing really risky, dangerous things. And I am very happy that I did not go down that road any further than I did.
Well, I hope by you writing this book too about your experience with poverty and overcoming that, and your, you know, family trauma and the things that you've done in your career, and like having this mindset around kids and hoping that they feel comfortable and confident coming to you, that hopefully people can see a different side of that. And that's really our mission here, is to help people understand like stories are so important, and you never know how someone got to where they are. And by being empathetic and caring and listening and trying to understand, is really what can change someone's life.
Absolutely.
If someone does want to keep in touch with you or keep an eye on what you're doing and, you know, stay up to date on your memoir, where can they find you?
Yeah, so you can find me on Instagram. My Instagram handle is KRYCP dot in leggings. And I am in leggings right now.
And we'll put that in the show notes too,
Yeah.
so you can easily find Kryssie, and we'll tag her on Instagram as well. And you know, we do always love to ask, what are some women who have inspired you in your
I thought you'd never ask. So I really wanted to focus on Black women for this question specifically, especially just with the research that I did about the history in Franklinton. Just really, I think that there have been some people who have done some amazing things, but when you learn about your own trauma and how hard it has been for you, and then when you realize that there is a group of people who it's been even harder for them just because of how they look, I think it just was a good reminder for me of like, wow, some people just existing is enough for a day. Like, you might look at someone and just them existing is harder than you existing. And so Miss Norman that I mentioned, her first name is Melanie Newman. If she's listening, I will be texting her this podcast episode. I think I said it all, but it was really cool because then when I became a teacher and I went back to second grade, she was teaching second grade. So I got to read. I used to love read aloud with her. And so every day she would read a story, a different chapter out of a book. And I just loved it. And so then when we taught the same grade level, I got to read some of the books that she read, not to me, but currently, like as a second grade teacher. And so she got to impact me not only as a student, but then as a teacher. So that was really cool. And then Viola Davis, if you have not read her book, I think every teacher should have to read that book. I read her book and I went, damn, I don't even know what poor is.
Yeah.
And I never thought I would say
it's
that.
Good to have perspective. You know what I mean? Somebody's always got it worse than you.
It's Finding Me, a memoir by Viola Davis.
Yes. And it's so good. And then I have another friend, her name is Sierra. But she got her PhD and we went to high school together. She grew up in the same area that I did. She's a Black American. She's just doing some incredible things. She wrote her master's thesis about the African American vernacular. and the impact that has on Black girls in the community. And she's just doing amazing things. She's a professor. And, I just really admire when you know the amount of tenacity you've had to have, and then you look at someone else and you're like, man, you had to have even more.
Yeah.
It just gives you a different view, I think. So
awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Kryssie. I know this is a deep topic and we appreciate you sharing and being vulnerable. Hopefully this inspires someone that's listening. Please make sure you share this episode if you think it will resonate with someone else. Give us a follow on Instagram, Spotify, Facebook. We do have a few events coming up here in the Columbus, Ohio area. So really looking forward to those. And Kryssie, we will see you around very soon.
Yeah.
See you guys next episode.
Thanks for having me.